Oh, there we go. All right. Well, welcome everyone. I think we're good. All right, Judy's all set up there, it looks like. So good evening and welcome to our virtual local history talk with Judy Humphries, our local history guru. She's going to be talking about the founding families of Gravenhurst tonight. This is an extension of her last talk, which was done a couple of years ago on the founding families of Gravenhurst. I think she's going to do a bit of a recap on that and then continue on to talk about some additional families that are of great importance here in Gravenhurst. I'm the CEO of the Gravenhurst Public Library, and we are working with Judy and the archives to provide this local history talk this evening. And we're so glad to see all of you tonight doing this virtually as we can. Before we get started, I would like to read our land acknowledgement statement. We acknowledge that the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis people were and are still the keepers and caretakers of the land and waters upon which the town of Gravenhurst now sits, which is covered by the Williams Treaty and the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty. We are deeply grateful for the enduring presence of the Indigenous peoples who have shaped and strengthened this community for the benefit of future generations, and we are committed to moving forward in the spirit of reconciliation and respect. Very important words. Thank you. You will notice that we've muted everyone tonight, and if you do not have, or you do have some issues with your network, or you can't see us, you can't hear us, we recommend that you shut down your video so that at least you can hear us tonight. Also, just wanted to let people know that there will be a bit of time at the end of Judy's talk to respond to questions that people may have. So people will be able to put those questions into the chat screen, which is at the bottom of your screen. If you move your cursor down and hover it over near the bottom of your screen, you'll be able to converse with Judy by chat. If you have a question and it doesn't get answered tonight, please send those questions on to the library, the Gravenhurst Public Library, or to Judy. Give us a call, let us know you have a question, or just send it by email. We are also recording this event tonight, this conversation with Judy. It will be posted on the library website within the next few days. So if you want to let people know who may not be able to attend, that would be great. And certainly we can afford to send out emails to people if they have those requests. Yes. Okay. For sure. All right. Okay. Just trying to do something here for Megan. Okay, just had to make her a co-host again. Hopefully that worked. Also, just to introduce Judy, who's our speaker tonight. I think probably a lot of you people already know Judy, but for those who are new to this conversation tonight, I wanted to give you Judy's bio. Judy was born in London, Ontario, but she grew up in various towns in Southern Ontario and completed her English degree at Western University, and then she did a teaching degree at the University of Queens in Kingston. She came to the Gravenhurst High School in 1973 to teach English, and then she left in 1982 in order to raise a family. When her kids were old enough, her and Hal's kids were old enough to go to school, she had a new and exciting career opportunity presented to her, and she became the librarian at the Ontario Fire College here in Gravenhurst. She would remain in this position for a period of 20 years. And the rest is history, as they say. And I think Judy really gained a real excitement and enjoyment for history when she did that job. Her third and very present career, managing the Gravenhurst archives as a volunteer, came with her retirement from the work world. And here we have her tonight. She is a very passionate historian, archivist, and she loves Gravenhurst. And she's going to talk tonight about those important things that are dearest and nearest to her. And we are so glad here at the Gravenhurst Public Library that we have an amazing symbiotic relationship with the archives. Over to you, Judy.
Good evening, everyone. I hope that everyone can hear me well. My voice is a little bit scratchy, so you will see me from time to time reaching for my trusty Coca-Cola or for my water bottle. While we're talking, I'd like you to do a little bit of thinking as we begin this evening's little sharing of information. When you hear somebody refer to the founders of a community, I wonder what you are thinking about, particularly when you think about Gravenhurst and the founding of Gravenhurst. Again, I wonder how you think about that and how you look upon what it must have been like to come here to nothing but wilderness, nothing at all, and begin a life. I find it absolutely mind-boggling sometimes to imagine anyone doing that. They would be walking here all the way, and they would be carrying what they owned on their backs. I'd like you to give some respect and some admiration in your mind to these wonderful people that we're going to talk about tonight. I am going to reprise the talk that I did 3 years ago. I did that talk in person at the time, and I'm going to try to bring back some of the things that I had to say then. I do really apologize for the voice. I don't know why it's like it is tonight, but it is. Maybe yelling at my kittens has done this to me. In my mind, the people that I wanted to focus on as founding members of our community were the people who came here and stayed long enough to make an impact. There were many, many people who came here and were maybe appeared on one census or within one directory or gazetteer, but in fact then left shortly thereafter. I really am hoping to talk more about the people who came, stayed long enough to impact the community that they had come to. I want to make a big thank you again to Gravenhurst Public Library and the staff here, who are, as anyone who deals with us here knows, all of the staff here are wonderful people, and they are so helpful in making this partnership work between Gravenhurst Archives and the Gravenhurst Public Library. Again, I apologize for the voice, but it is as I have it at this moment. Let's begin. Whoops, we've just got one more person to admit. We don't seem to be moving. There we go. Most of the people who are familiar with the idea of Gravenhurst as a brand new community beginning way back in the time of early settlement have heard of James and Letitia McCabe. They are in fact the first settlers of Gravenhurst. They came in 1859, James and Letitia did, to the east side of Muskoka Road, and there they built a shanty, and they had a little bit of a land grant there. It ran from Carolyn Street basically over to Main Street, and it was on both sides of the Muskoka Road, or the colonization road. In 1862, they built a newer home on the west side of the colonization road, And they opened up that home to be a bit of a hostel, I guess you could call it, or a, well, they called it a hotel. They called it, in fact, the Freemasons' Arms. Now, it's James McCabe who gets all the credit, I think, when gazetteers are being read for his role as so many things in the new community. But I like to think that it was, in fact, Letitia who had the most influence and the most impact, perhaps, on Gravenhurst and its development. They came to this little piece of land once they had actually secured ownership of it, which is what you had to do. You had a location ticket. You had that ticket for the amount of time that you were allotted to build a home and to clear some land, and then you would be given a deed. So once they had the deed to the land, they in fact then gave a piece of land, a chunk of land, to the people of the, what we might call the English church or the Episcopal church, or in fact, I think the best name for it is probably, as we know it, the Anglican church. So they gave a piece of land on which the Anglican church could build a church and they could build a cemetery, and they did so. So if you're wondering where on earth we're talking about when I say Carolyn Street to Main Street, in fact, we're talking about the place where the Anglican cemetery, St. James Cemetery, is today on Muskoka Road, just down from the arch. This is the piece of land that they gave to the Anglican or Episcopal church. It was a 1 acre lot, and that's the church that was built by the people of the congregation at that time. It's a log church. It was built roughly 1865 to 1867. Took them a while. They had to secure some money and clear the land, do all of that. Eventually, after James McCabe had done, whoopsie daisy, had done all of the things that he wanted to do, he was a boat builder. He categorized himself as a barrel maker, a freight agent, a grocer, a weaver, wharf manager. In actual fact, what he often did was take his scow and and take people up and down the lake in his scow, looking for a piece of land, perhaps just going out on a voyage on Lake Muskoka to kind of look around and see where they were. But remember that this is a time when this piece of land, this piece of territory we're talking about, is not the town of Gravenhurst or the village of Gravenhurst. It is McCabe's Landing. That's all it is. And it has very, very few people in it. By the time he got to 1867, he had lost Letitia. Letitia died in 1867. She was very young. She was only 50 years old. And he simply lost his heart, I think, at that point. He didn't know how he was going to run the Freemasons' Arms anymore without her. After all, it was Letitia who had talked to A.P. Coburn when he came through in 1865 on a little tour. It was Letitia that talked to A.P. Coburn and actually gave him the idea of going down to McCabe's Landing on the bay, taking a little scow out and taking a little run up the lake. When he did that, he completely changed his viewpoint about what he was going to do. So that's why I say Letitia had a big hand in making people welcome, in giving them ideas about what to do. And when Letitia died, I think that James simply lost his heart. 2 years later, he did remarry a woman with 6 children. She was a widow. And he took up farming and sold the Freemasons' Arms onto a man named Horton before then sending, he eventually sold the hotel on to Benjamin Fuller. So this is going to be the last we'll see of James and Letitia McCabe. No one knows where they're buried. No one knows really where they went once they had, in fact, left the Freemasons' Arms. So we're going to leave them now and move on to the fact that Dawson LeSueur, a postal employee in Ottawa, named our little settlement of McCabe's Landing, which is a lovely name, I think. He named it Gravenhurst. Now, why on earth did he get the chance to do that? Well, the little community would have perhaps made application to the post office to have an official post office in this little settlement. It didn't really have a bona fide name. It was being called McCabe's Landing, but that wasn't a registered name. So they applied for that post office, and in doing so, they were applying for a name as well. It was Dawson Lasser's job to actually give names to little settlements that were getting new post offices. He had been reading a book called Gravenhurst, or Thoughts on Good and Evil. It was a book by a man named William Smith. And so he simply, I think, looked at that name Gravenhurst and said, there's a name. I will call this little settlement Gravenhurst. And so we had a name and a post office in one fell swoop. I'm trying to get rid of the bar at the top, which I suspect you can all see, but I'm not getting rid of it very easily. Am I? No, I'm not. This here.
Oh, no, nobody else can see that.
Oh, good. Okay. Nobody else can see that. Wonderful. No.
Oh, sorry.
Nope. Here we go. I'm going to be talking about one of my favorite founding families and one of my favorite founders, and that is Joseph Brock. This is the man who, if you were with me when I was talking about getting from here to there, this is the man who in 1860, living on his father's farm in Thamesford, which is way down by St. Mary's, down by London, Ingersoll, if you know those communities, that's sort of down where Thamesford is. He was living on his father's farm at the time, and he was thinking to himself that he would really like a tract of land, perhaps a little wilder than it would have been down there. And by the time that he was coming of age to actually have a farm of his own, most of the really good farmland was not available. So he left Thamesford walking in 1860. He walked 300 kilometers from Thamesford, through the bush, along roads, along pathways, and made it to McCabe's Landing in 1860 in the fall. He liked what he saw. There wasn't much to see, of course, it was mostly all wilderness. But he set up a little shelter, basically in the place where the Baptist church is located today. And the shelter he left there as a place to come back to. He applied for a land grant, and he walked back 300 kilometers to Thamesford to help his father with the harvest and to help get ready for winter. Once spring of 1861 came along, he hitched up a wagon, 2 oxen, and tied his cow to the, to the wagon, and he headed out walking from Thamesford back to McCabe's Landing, or Gravenhurst, as it would become, in spring of 1861. In 1862, he had a land grant that ran, as you can see on the map outlined below in color. He had a land grant from Church Street to Sharp Street. So we're going from north at Church Street down to the southern part, down to Sharp Street, and then from Muskoka Road over to Gull Lake. That land grant would prove to be what he needed for the rest of his life to make a living and so on. He married a girl named Annie Brines. We'll meet her family a little bit later. He met and married her in 1865. He subdivided his land and sold it on to new settlers who were coming along. He built a new home, a log home, not the shelter, and not in the location where the shelter had been, but rather at the northeast corner of Muskoka Road at Brock Street. Now you're saying to yourself, if you know directions, that that's where the Albion Hotel sits right now. And indeed, you're right. That's exactly where he built his log home. And that's where he took Annie Brines, his new wife. Now he did rent that log cabin out for a while, and you'll hear about that later on. But in fact, that was his home, and his home for Annie and his 10 children, not all of whom survived. In fact, he subdivided, sold that land that he had so that he was making money. He wasn't making a killing by any means, but he was making enough money to live on. In fact, the family of Joseph Brock returned to southwestern Ontario, to Thamesford area, in about 1880. They had a chance to pick up a piece of good farmland, and so they did so. But it wasn't all that long after that that I think he really got wanderlust again and decided that, in fact, he wanted some open spaces. And so Joseph Brock and his family headed west. They headed to Saskatchewan, kind of near Weyburn in Saskatchewan, and that was where they settled. He had a son, of those 10 children, one who stands out. His name was Joseph Brock Jr. Joseph Brock Jr. was certainly with his dad and family on all of these little treks, but in actual fact, did keep coming back from Chelmsford to Gravenhurst to take a look at what was going on with his dad's land holdings and his dad's business and so on. Joseph Brock Jr. Eventually went west as well and ended up settling out west in the same neighborhood as his parents. He and his wife also raised 10 children, some of whom later returned around the time of the Great Depression in the 1930s, returned back to Gravenhurst. And aren't we lucky that they did so? Because William Brock, or Bill Brock, and his wife Jessie lived here and raised their children here. That gave us Barry Brock and his wife Gail and Mike Brock. Mike, unfortunately, we lost far too soon. Barry Brock is absolutely the backbone of Gravenhurst Archives. So what can I say except thank goodness for Joseph? Anyway, the Brock home was moved from that Albion location that I was talking about, was moved all the way east down past First Street. You can sort of picture that, going along Brock Street and all the way down to about just past First Street. One of my absolutely favorite founding fathers, I guess we'll call him, it is a founding family, is Thomas Robinson. Tom Robinson came here very, very early, just like Joseph Brock. He came here in 1860. He was a Scotsman. He'd been a sailor when he was living in the old country, as we would call it. But at the age of 25, he decided to go for adventure. And he emigrated from Scotland and came to Muskoka, came looking for free grant land. And he got here and went down to the bay, McCabe's Landing, went looking around in the bush to see what he could find. And sure enough, there was a birch bark canoe and a paddle. So he paddled his way along the shoreline of Muskoka Bay. He was looking for a place to build a home. In fact, he found the perfect property in 1860 along the bay. And if you want to picture it for people who are Gravenhurstians, you can picture it as being from the cliffs where everybody used to go swimming, all the way out to the point where Muskoka Regional Center is today. So he had a very long and a very beautiful tract of land in mind. He said to himself, aha, this is where I want to be. He went back to England, returned with a bride, Fanny, and came back to build a log home on the bay. By 1861, they were in fact taking in travelers to what they called Robinson House. And Robinson House, as pictured here on the right, was in fact the first tourist resort in Muskoka. Thomas Robinson was a true Renaissance man. He was extremely literate. He was also very witty. He was well-versed in all sorts of things, in literature and so on. And he wrote a number of articles and descriptions of Muskoka and life in Muskoka, some of which still exist today. He became a court official when needed. He became a meteorological recorder for the government. And he also used to keep a register, which we have, of when the ice went out on Lake Muskoka or Muskoka Bay. And we have a long list of when it went in and when it went out. He was an actor, an amateur actor. He loved to tell stories. So he was a raconteur. And he used to build sailboats and race them as well. And the story is that if it was Thomas Robinson in the race, you could pretty much forget any chance of winning that race. Just a little note, Thomas Robinson's Robinson House, the first tourist resort in Muskoka, would go on to become the Three Flowers Inn, which in fact was another tourist resort. And from Thomas Robinson's property would spring the sanatorium called Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium, would spring the free hospital for the treatment of consumptives, and the Ontario Fire College. So all of those are built on the property that Thomas Robinson had. James Sharp came to Gravenhurst, or I guess we're still talking McCabe's Landing, in 1861. You'll notice, by the way, that I don't have any notes in front of me, and that's because I have a little problem here. I have my notes over on another computer, but in fact, it's pretty difficult to be looking over there and not to be looking at you. So here I am. I'm looking at you instead. James Sharp was another one of those canny Scotsmen. He had been a former soldier. He had been a farmer. And at the age of 41, which I think is fairly, getting up there in these days, brought his family to Canada. And in 1861, he brought them to McCabe's Landing. He was one of those really energetic men who was willing to do just about anything to support his family. So he became a wharfinger, which is the wharf manager. He became a shipping agent for the navigation company. He became the government inspector for weights and measures. He did all of the kinds of things that you might expect any really energetic man to do. But he was also a very involved citizen. He was a man who set up the petition to the government to ask that we have McCabe's Landing incorporated as a village of Gravenhurst, and of course was successful in having that happen, although much later. He was the immigration agent for the town, and he had a wife, Margaret, and 5 children whom he helped to raise. One of his children was the man who's on the right, his son, John Sharp. And John Sharp built the Caledonian Hotel, which is pictured in the center of your screen, along with a little store, which is kind of in the front, if you like, to the front and to the right of the main hotel part, called Caledonian House. And he built all of that in 1880. Caledonian House and Hotel were quite successful, both as hotels and as stores. But in 1887, the Great Fire of Gravenhurst destroyed the entire thing. As we know, and we can talk about another time, destroyed the entire main street of Gravenhurst. It was very, very quick for John Sharp to rebuild that hotel. He rebuilt it and called it the Empress Hotel, and this time built it of brick in 1888. In fact, there was, of course, a bylaw that had been enacted saying that all buildings in the core must be built of brick. And so here it is, the Empress Hotel, 1888, with a group of men standing out front. They may very well be waiting for one of the kinds of vehicles that would convey them down to the wharf, or that might convey them to the train station in 1888. Of course, the trains would be running by then. James died 10 years after that new hotel was built in 1897. But in fact, John continued to run the Empress Hotel until 1906 when he died. The hotel was bought by a man named Gilmore in 1909. He bought it and then sold it immediately and left town. I have no idea why. I don't know what the story is there, but he returned to town in 1919 and repurchased the hotel and ran it as the Gilmore Hotel through until I guess his death as well. It continued as the Gilmore Hotel, in fact, until 1985. And then it was made into a business and apartments and all of those sorts of things. The Gilmore was sort of an interesting drinking establishment, I understand. Not one of the more luxurious and fancy spots, but in fact, it was a nice hotel at one time with very nice rooms and so on to rent. Mary and William Moody came along at just about the same time as we're talking about with all of these other folks here. William came from Quebec and he settled in McCabe's Landing in 1861. He had an 80-acre land grant, and so he knew that he could afford to have a wife and so on. He married a young woman named Mary Brock. Now, you've heard that name before, Brock. She was Joseph Brock's sister. And those Brocks were nothing if they were not intrepid travelers. Mary Brock set out from Thamesford to visit her brother Joseph in 1862, and she walked. She walked from Thamesford, 300 kilometers, to Gravenhurst. She was by herself. I won't say that she was completely without fear. Apparently, she was pretty nervous at times because of the wolves and so on, but she managed to get here. And yeah, the Brocks are nothing if they're not intrepid people. She married William Moody in 1863, but the Moodys left Gravenhurst almost immediately after that, 1865. And they went first to Toronto, where he secured a job for a while. And then they went to St. Mary's, where he had a store. And they ran a store in St. Mary's for about 10 years, I guess, before they returned to Gravenhurst in 1875. They decided to build a home and general store combined, and they built it on the northeast corner of Muskoka Road at Church Street. And that home and general store was run by them for quite a while. Shortly after that, they actually opened an additional store on the main street of Gravenhurst, on the west side of Gravenhurst Street, Muskoka Road, and they ran a dry goods store there. They were burned out in the Great Fire of 1887, of course, and they decided to return and consolidate back in their home and general store that they had built earlier. About 1898, Mary Moody began taking in travelers and tourists and visitors. And by 1900, she had actually decided to turn it into an apartment house. And this became Moody's Terrace. It was, in fact, a building with apartments in it, which she ran until her death. William died in 1929. Mary died in 1933. But not before she sold the family business of Moody Terrace. And she sold it to a man named Harry Martin. Harry Martin decided to tear down Moody Terrace and to build what would become a luxurious and very highly respected motor hotel for the affluent tourist. And there it is, Martin Manor. There were cabins in the back for the people who liked to think that they were roughing it, even though in fact they were having dinner in a lovely dining room in Martin Manor. In fact, it was regarded so highly that when the Crown Prince of Norway, Prince Olaf, and his Princess Martha came to Gravenhurst to open Little Norway during the Second World War, the pilot training school, the prince and his wife, the man who would be king, were housed at Martin Manor during their visit. So it tells you about how highly regarded, in fact, that property really was. And it was, in fact, a luxurious and lovely, lovely spot. Martin Manor continued as a tourist home for decades before being converted to a very, very nice retirement home today. I mentioned to you a girl named Annie Brines a while back. She was the daughter of Jane and Henry Brines, and we'll talk about them for a moment. And this gives me another chance to talk about a woman who made more impact than her husband on the community of Gravenhurst. Jane and Henry Brines came to Gravenhurst kind of the hard way, if you like. They came from County Armagh in Ireland, and they married while they were there, and then they emigrated in the mid-1830s to Rhode Island. Whether it was the Civil War or what it was, I don't really know what drove them out of the United States and made them come to Canada, but they did. And they not only came to Canada, but in 1862, they came to McCabe's Landing and took up a 100-acre land grant. And the map that you see there on the right shows you that it was just at the very, very edge of Gravenhurst. You can see Muskoka Colonization Road is running up, and the railroad that would come is running along the side there. And you can see it's spelled there B-R-Y, I think that's O-N-S, but in fact it was Brines. Jane Brines was invaluable. If there was any such thing as an emergency medical technician, she'd have been one. She was, in fact, a medical caregiver who was constantly called whenever anyone was sick, whenever anyone was in childbirth, and she was the one who was called in the absence of a doctor, or maybe the high cost of a doctor, to come and treat the sick and the hurt and the people in childbirth. Much to the chagrin, by the way, I might add, of Dr. John Adam, who was not very pleased to have his meager living cut by the fact that she was doing much of this work for free. And not only did she do that kind of work for free, but it was really she who raised a lot of money towards the 3 Anglican churches that would be built during her lifetime in Gravenhurst. She raised money for that log church that you saw earlier, and then for the new brick church that was built in central Gravenhurst in 1885. When that burned down in the Great Fire of 1887, she raised money for at least the carpet and some of the furnishings in the new St. James Anglican Church that would be built. She raised a family and was buried in 1900 in St. James Cemetery, as is only fitting. The people that we've been talking about so far, that would be Joseph Brock and Tom Robinson and James McCabe, James Sharp, Henry Brines. All of these people not only came and built their own homes, but they were members of a community and saw themselves as such. So they did all sorts of other things for the community. And among those things was the coming together to build a school and a community meeting place, which they did by cutting down trees, hewing logs, and building a log school in 1863. It would be demolished in 1873, and it would be replaced by a 2-room North Ward school, which you see on the right there. That was the first, those were the first schools in Gravenhurst. And they were also where high school classes were held until high school could be built here. I'm going to briefly mention Edward Canal because he's a man who has a very confused story related to him. He, in fact, apparently built a hotel called the Muskoka Bay Hotel, or he built a hotel called the Northern Hotel, or he built a hotel called the Railroad Hotel. There are 3 different versions of what he actually built. All we know is that it was definitely a hotel, and it was built sometime around, or maybe even before 1864. It burned to the ground on May the 30th, 1867, and that is consistent throughout the 3 stories. Unfortunately, the location is not consistent. The Muskoka Bay Hotel was appropriately on Muskoka Bay, but the Railroad Hotel and the Northern Hotel were both said to be on the southwest corner of Muskoka Road at Bay Street. So picture that for a moment. And if you can picture where T-Beards used to be, or where the Cottage Rose was, that's where we're talking about the hotel being. But as I say, it burned to the ground in 1867. Eventually I found him. I was trying to locate where he'd gone after that. And he turned up in Muskoka still, but on Maple Island as the postmaster. And we know nothing else about him. Dougal Brown is a name that is worth reckoning with. He settled in Gravenhurst in 1863. Dougal Brown was another one of those very energetic Scotsmen. He came from Cape Breton, where his family had emigrated to from Scotland, and then came on to Gravenhurst, which it was by now, in 1863. He had 2 things in mind that he wanted to do, and the first of them was to build a hotel. And he began constructing the Steamboat and Stage Hotel in 1868, and it opened on July 1st of 1869. He also began Brown's Beverages in 1873. He began it actually on Hotchkiss Street. If you kind of know where that is where the Anglican Church is, but he was on the other side of the street and down by Sarah Street. So he built his first Brown's Beverages there, but needed a new and much enlarged property, very soon. So he moved his property and his Brown's Beverages up to the Bay Street location it has today. He sold the hotel in 1876, which wasn't all that long after he'd opened it. But that was because he had many other irons in the fire. By the time he had built that hotel, he owned 92 pieces of property in and around Gravenhurst. And most of those went from the Steamboat and Stage, which is where the post office is today. Most of those properties that he owned were built between that post office corner and Muskoka Bay. So he had that great tract of land in there. And that's where he had all kinds of property, which he bought and sold. When he sold his hotel in 1876, it was because he wanted to do something about lumbering. And he actually opened a lumber mill on Muskoka Bay. But this was a man who had all sorts of ideas about what he wanted to do. As I say, an energetic Scotsman. So there's a picture of what was the Steamboat and Stage Hotel. It's now in this picture, the Fraser Hotel, after it's been sold in 1876. It would be sold on to become the Lafreniere Hotel after that. And you can see an ad that was placed for Brown's Hotel, Dougal Brown proprietor, in one of the many publications. Dougal wasn't satisfied with just a hotel, which he had sold, or just Brown's Beverages, which he was still operating. He also was operating a livery service with a man named John Scott. And he married John Scott's daughter, Sarah, after he had been here for a while. Excuse me, the voice is going to need to be pacified a bit. This is a picture of Dougal Brown on the left with his wife, Sarah, and his son, JD, and his daughter. And on the right is a picture of Dougal Brown with his second wife, Louisa. He lost his first wife very, very young. Sarah died quite young, and it wasn't long, 2 more years, before he married Louisa King, the daughter of George King. They had a son, but the son lived for only a few months before dying. And you can see that Dougal Brown is not looking all that well in this photograph. That's because he'd had a serious lung ailment. And then after that, he became ill again. And it wasn't long before he died at the very, very early age of 44. But I'm going to tell you a story about how much he loved racing horses. Dougal Brown was an adventurer all the way around. And there's a story that's been told in a couple of different versions about an event that occurred on July the 1st in 1880. July the 1st was always an occasion for horse races. And Dougal Brown had a very fast mare, and he challenged a man from Morrison Township to race him. Now, he had someone else riding the mare in this race. They were going to start off from the Queen's Hotel, which is the old Freemasons' Arms, if you like. They were going to race down Muskoka Road all the way down to the Royal Hotel, which was built, you'll hear about it in a moment, which was built at the corner of Royal Street and Muskoka Road. All very well. The 2 horses took off. They were just flying down Muskoka Road, heading north. They had a sort of almost a nose-to-nose kind of run, with the exception of the fact that by almost to the end of the race, Dougal Brown's horse was in the lead. All of a sudden, much to the consternation of certainly the rider, the horse changed its mind. And in fact, it turned around completely and went all the way back to the Queen's Hotel, throwing its rider in the process. People scattered left and right because, of course, they'd all closed in along the road to watch this race. And now the horse appeared to have a mind of its own and was heading back to the Queen's Hotel. I suspect that, in fact, Dougal had to ante up on that race. Not a man to give up easily. He was a man who decided to challenge again. So he ran to the Queen's Hotel. He leaped himself into the saddle and decided to race again against another horse that had taken up the bet. And they raced down Muskoka Road again. Now, this horse must have been in quite a lather at this point. They raced all the way down to the Royal Hotel. And when they got there, the horse, instead of coming to a halt, Dougal couldn't make him do it at all, simply headed for the stable at the back of the Royal Hotel. Now, I think Dougal could see the writing on the wall. He was going to go right through the back of the barn. Luckily, there was a wagon sitting just outside that stable. It was filled with straw. He leaped into the wagon just as the horse was going through the open doors of the stable. I think a great sigh went up from the people assembled, wondering what would happen, but Dougal rose from the wagon mostly unhurt, and the horse stopped dead in its tracks inside the stable and walked quietly over to a little pile of hay where he began to eat. Good thing that Dougal Brown's whole life was not involved with betting on horses and horse races. In fact, was involved heavily in Brown's beverages, which continued to expand and grow and expand and grow. And when Dougal died, which was, as I say, at a very young age, he then, or his family then was faced with running Brown's beverages. And the son, J.D. Brown, was only 19 years old. He took over Brown's beverages and expanded it with the help of Louisa, who also was helping to run it. And so we have a picture here of Brown's beverages expanding and then in its present location today, although that picture was taken in the 1940s, I believe, on Bay Street. John Duncan Brown, the 19-year-old who had taken over Brown's beverages, in fact, had another dream. In 1900, he built Pinedale Inn on Gull Lake. And by 1910, he was able to accommodate 100 guests. He had a tuck shop, dance hall, lawn bowling, and what appealed to everybody, I think, was a giant slide down into the lake. It was a very, very popular resort for a very long time. And it continues today in quite a different form, but still Pinedale Inn. Sid Brown, son of J.D., owned a gas station and a garage. And I'm wondering if you can picture where it was located. If you take a look at the picture on the bottom right, and you look at the house, Sid's house in the background of that garage, it may give you a pretty good clue as to where that garage was located. I'm hoping you can recognize it and recognize his house next door, both where they were and what they became in the future. Ask me at the end if you don't. In 1939, he bought Pinedale Inn out from the rest of the relatives and ran it until 1959 when he sold it on. Harvey was an interesting man. I've shown you a picture of him as a young man on the left, John Thompson Harvey, and on the right as an aging man. See how similar they look in these two pictures. I thought it was interesting, almost the same jacket, if you can imagine. Anyway, he was born in Orillia in 1847, and he helped to run his father's stage line with two of his brothers before coming to Gravenhurst because he could see that it was an up-and-coming community and that a train line was probably going to come through there someday. But in the meantime, he settled in Gravenhurst in 1868, took over the Coburn stage line that had been set up, and he ran 100 teams of horses until 1875. Now, I've seen that confirmed in two different places, so I don't think it was a misprint. I think it's absolutely the truth. And descriptions I've read of what it was like to travel on the colonization road when a whole group of those teams were heading up the highway, you can only imagine. Apparently, anybody else traveling on the colonization road had simply to get off the road, and up went those teams, one after the other, pulling various kinds of wagons and so on. They would be moving people, they would be moving freight, they were moving the mail, and they were moving it all to the north. In 1875, when the train actually did come to Gravenhurst, it cut substantially into both his mail run and into the running of passengers and freight. So he then took on the mail run that would go to the north until 1885 when the train moved north, and to small communities along the way that didn't have train access. But J.T. Harvey was not simply a man running a stage line. He became involved in the politics of the community, and he was, in fact, the first mayor of the town of Gravenhurst, the town being set up as a town in 1887. Just a quick look at one of his advertisements, because he was, in fact, a Royal Mail stage, and the stages were running daily, as you can see, to the free grant lands. This is a picture to the right, a drawing in the C.W. Jeffries book of what it was like to run a stagecoach on the kinds of roads that we had coming to Gravenhurst. Passengers had to leap out, help to push, help to move the stagecoach ahead. J.T. Harvey lived in a house on Harvey Street, not a surprise. And the house that you see there, which was just getting ready to be demolished behind those two lovely blue spruce, was in fact the home in which he lived. That home became a home for several doctors before it was torn down to make way for the Bank of Nova Scotia. And on the wall of the Bank of Nova Scotia, you can see that there is, in fact, a historic plaque commemorating John Harvey and his life on that particular spot. People are probably wondering why I haven't gotten to the Coburns more quickly, but in fact, I'm doing everything in chronological order. And I'm going to be talking not so much about AP Coburn as I am about the Coburns who contributed directly to the life of Gravenhurst, not Muskoka totally, but Gravenhurst. And the first one to do so was Peter, better known as Bucky Coburn, along with his wife, Mary. In 1865-66, Peter Coburn came from the area of Ontario called Stormont, Finch Township in Stormont County, which is down in Eastern Ontario. He came up to Beaverton and then came to Gravenhurst and began lumbering operations by buying logs from the settlers. In 1870, he would go on to set up a lumber mill on Muskoka Bay as well, although he wasn't terribly successful at that. In 1868 to 73, he became the postmaster of Gravenhurst. And in fact, he of the Coburns really did contribute here because he brought with him his four sons. He had John Peter, also known as J.P. Coburn. He had Alexander Peter, known better as A.P. Coburn, a daughter, Mary Ann, and a son, Isaac. He died in 1896, and he and his wife, Mary, are both buried in Lakeview Cemetery. A.P. Coburn was, again, an up-and-comer, a very energetic man. He, along with a man named J.T. Kirkpatrick, who was incidentally J.P.'s brother-in-law, got the contract for Muskoka Road to upgrade it and so on. And so that was a huge contract for them, and they contracted all the lumber and the hundreds of men that they would need to upgrade the road. He was instrumental in setting up the Montreal store. We always hear of it being A.P. Coburn, but in fact, once the name A.P. had been sort of attached to the Montreal store in Gravenhurst, after that and from then on, J.P. Coburn was the man who actually ran that store, and it was eventually called Coburn and Company, or various other names, the Settlers Depot and so on. He also established a coach line to the wharf, and I've mentioned that J.T. Harvey, in fact, bought out that coach line and took it over. And he took over being postmaster after his father had given it up from 1874 to 1877. If you look at a list of the people who lost property during the Great Fire, he lost 3 buildings in downtown Gravenhurst. Here's Alexander Peter, or A.P. Coburn. who, while touring Muskoka in 1865, got into a conversation at the Freemasons' Arms with Letitia McCabe. And it was Letitia who convinced him to go and take a good look around Muskoka Bay in the scow that was down there, which changed his mind about everything that he was going to do. He reported to Darcy McGee, who was in the federal government in the Department of Agriculture, that this was an area ripe for settlement. And he was absolutely insistent on constantly promoting the area to the government and to incoming settlers. He was regularly publishing booklets extolling the virtues of Muskoka, and he set out a whole raft of guidebooks for new settlers and how to live here and what to do and where to get things and so on. He built a fleet of steamships, the first of which was the Winona in the spring of 1866, and he built it right on the shore of Muskoka Bay. His fleet would eventually extend to 10 steamships. He encouraged resorts on the 3 Muskoka lakes. He became the head of the Muskoka Navigation Company at the time, well, throughout its history, I guess, until they built as well the beautiful resort out on the lakes. He became the MPP for North Victoria County, which is really where his home was at Beaverton. He was the MPP from 1872 with only a couple of blips till 1882 for North Victoria, which also included not only Beaverton, but Muskoka itself and Gravenhurst. Elections, by the way, were held annually for all posts, provincial, federal, and municipal. So we're looking at a person who had to run every year. In 1882, he went on to become the MP for North Ontario County. There was actually a county in Ontario called Ontario, and there was a riding called North Ontario, which contained Gravenhurst, and he became the MP for that riding. I think we can say without any doubt that he was truly a Renaissance man. He published not only all of those pamphlets and booklets I've been talking about, but he wrote and published the Political Annals of Canada in 1904, just before he died in 1905. He did have a home here, which he built in 1878 on Bay Street, although the location is sometimes up for debate. But really, I believe that he only used it as a place where he could sleep when he did come to Gravenhurst. He was more of a Muskoka man. His home and heart perhaps were in Beaverton. His family, his wife and 5 children, actually lived in Toronto. They lived on Walmer Road, right downtown Toronto, in a lovely home there, and never really considered Gravenhurst as anything to do with where they lived or thought of. I think we can consider him not the father of Gravenhurst, but the father of Muskoka and Muskoka tourism. Along came another fellow named Emmanuel Coburn in 1871. Actually, it was 1870 when he began to build the Royal Hotel. We never did have a dearth of hotels in Gravenhurst, and this one was a lovely one indeed. The Royal Hotel was built on the southeast corner of Muskoka Road at what is now Royal Street. Makes sense. And apparently it was considered to be a pretty elegant hotel in some parts of it, although it had, on the one hand, an elegant ladies' parlor that was described in a billiards room, well-stocked bar, but on the other hand, it had a lot of very strange furnishings and decorations, mainly to do with the hunting world. So lots of antlers and stuffed animals and whatnot. There was a hall just to the south of the hotel, accessed by a staircase there, which actually became a meeting hall and a dance hall whenever large dances were going to be held. He also had a stable, and right next door, a blacksmith set up his shop. So it was a great place to stay until the Great Fire of 1887, which completely burned it to the ground, and Emmanuel Cooper did not rebuild his hotel. I'm just going to show you quickly that there are all kinds of directories for Ontario for year after year after year throughout the history of Gravenhurst and Ontario. This is one that was printed in 1871 by the Lovell Company when our population was around 400. And it shows the people, mainly all men. Only a few women are listed, and they would be the Miss Gill dressmaker type or the Miss Kyler school teacher type. Not, in fact, any married women would ever be listed here, but it gives you an idea of the number of people and the kinds of jobs that they were engaged in 1871. In 1872, a man named Henry Robert, or H.R. King, a lot of people were known by their initials. That was a sort of way that they had, or by nicknames. He arrived in Gravenhurst in 1872 and set up a butcher business. And very, very quickly, because he was so successful, he had 3 assistants working for him. And he also was able to run a livery business. Now that sounds sort of odd, but there was method in his madness. Henry Robert King had very quickly scoped out the area and decided that hunters were the people that he might really like to support and interact with. So what did he do? Well, he was able to outfit hunters with horses from his livery. He had 15 hounds bred for hunting, and he had 200 acres of land a half-mile north of town. So he could actually invite hunters to come to Gravenhurst. They could stock up at his butcher shop because he sold groceries and so on all the provisions that they would need for a hunting party. They could take a horse, they could take some hounds, they could go to the 200 acres of land that he owned, and they could shoot to their heart's content. And when they were all done, they could come back to H.R. King Butcher Shop, bringing with them the beasts they had killed. Who better than HR to buy those beasts and to, in fact, sell them? This is actually a variation, if you like, on your local meat counter today. If you normally are used to walking down the meat aisle and looking in all the various glass-topped cases for whatever you would like to have for supper. This is a little bit like that. You can walk along and pick out your beast, and you can decide which one is going to give you your roast, and as it's hanging there. In the background, you can make out Clipschman's Carriage Works, and you can just see the vestiges of the sign at the top. So that tells you where H.R. King was located, because he was just down from the corner of Phillip Street on Muskoka Road. That's where he was on Muskoka Road, on the west side of the road, just down from the National Bank today. He was actively involved in the Anglican Church. He was also actively involved in city politics or town politics. He became a mayor and a councillor in town council, and he became a warden in the Anglican Church as well. He lived here for the rest of his life. And although lost his entire business during the Great Fire of 1887, he rebuilt in 1888. George Washington Taylor is another man who, about the same time, in 1875, he came because he recognized that, again, being an energetic Scotsman, he recognized that Gravenhurst was where the action was happening. The train had just come in 1875, and he felt that this was a town on the verge of great things. He wanted to do 2 things, so he bought 2 properties. One of them was a lot on Lake Muskoka, Muskoka Bay, where he could build a lumber mill. The other was the Brock property on Muskoka Road at Brock Street, the place where the log cabin was located. He bought that property, moved the Brock log cabin down to the east of First Street, and in its place began to build the Albion Hotel in 1879. Now, there are variations on this story, but the story goes that, in fact, his wife urged him I will say, urged him to sell the hotel while it was being built, lest he should become its best customer when it was done. In actual fact, he sold the Albion, skeletal though it was, to two men, one of whom was Frank Wassley. And Frank Wassley would go on to become the sole owner of the Albion Hotel. George Washington Taylor was a well-respected man. His lumber mill, called the G.W. Taylor Lumber Company, did well, and he became the first reeve of the village of Gravenhurst in 1877, and he won election to that post for 5 consecutive years. James Everett Clipschman, I've mentioned the Coburn Carriage Works. James Everett Clipschman came with his brother Mickel to Muskoka early on, and they stopped basically in Morrison Township, where James operated a blacksmith shop and his brother Mickel took up farming near Sparrow Lake. The blacksmith shop was located roughly at Malta, which is just along Highway 11. If you know where the Little Red Schoolhouse is on Highway 11, that's Malta. What he learned very quickly was that the road between Aurelia, Washego, and Gravenhurst was terrible. And it took a toll on every wagon, sleigh, whatever it was that was moving all the way up that road. It took a toll on horseshoes as well. And he spent most of his time in Malta actually repairing wagons and shoeing horses. He too believed that Gravenhurst was where the coming future was, and so he moved to Gravenhurst in 1877 and opened the Clipschman Carriage Works. He made equipment for lumber companies, he made farm implements and tools, he built sleighs and wagons for both farmers and for the logging industry, and created carriages and buggies for the people that we would consider to be the people of the town. He too was burned out in the fire of 1887, but he rebuilt he rebuilt his business in 1888. It was a 2-story building, as you can kind of guess, and it had a place for all of the different activities that he did. The original Clipschman Carriage Works is shown on the left. The newly rebuilt Clipschman Carriage Works is on the right. You can see that he was also an agent for organs and sewing machines and heaven knows what else. I think one of the things that we really want to laud him for is the fact that Clipschman House was built of brick behind the carriage works. It was not destroyed during the Great Fire. At that point, the fire was beginning to burn itself out. Clipschman House survived and has been protected by Municipal Heritage Committee as a designated building, one of the oldest buildings in Gravenhurst, certainly one very lovely home. And we are very lucky to have it surviving into today. I can't leave this without talking about Charles Mickel, who is, to my mind, one of the great fathers and founders, along with his wife, Emma, of Gravenhurst. I would see him, perhaps, along with Tom Robinson, as the father of Gravenhurst. He came to Gravenhurst in 1877. He'd been a small-time lumberman in southwestern Ontario. He married Emma. Emma was Emma Rowe in Paisley. And then they began to look for a place to settle. They came to Gravenhurst in 1877, and he went into partnership with Andrew Tate in the Tate Mill in 1878, but he bought out Tate in 1882. He formed a partnership very quickly with, after that, with Nathaniel Diamond. Nathaniel Diamond lived in Barrie. He was a financier. That was kind of his background. He was also involved in the lumber trade, though. That partnership would result in all kinds of activity and lumber mills across Muskoka and elsewhere. They built what was called, well, they had the Tate Mill to start with. They built the new mill in 1886 and called it that. In 1889, their West Gravenhurst mill burned to the ground. And I'm just going to show you a picture of where that was. If you take a look at the picture on the left, you can see where the Mickel mill was, and the original Mickel home is there behind it with the arrow pointing to it. It also burned in 1889. Emma was lucky to get their little boy, Charles Mickel Jr., who was maybe 2 years old, out of the house before it burned to the ground. Just to go back, I'll just mention that after that mill burned down, he added a planing mill to new mill, expanded by buying a mill in Severn Bridge in 1892, and then built a shingle mill in Gravenhurst called the Pepper Mill, which was named after the manager, whose name was Mr. Pepper. New mill, the one that I've mentioned there, built in 1886, would operate until 1926. And there's a picture of it on the right there with some of its workers on the high sort of scaffold, if you like, kind of area along the mill. We'll talk about lumber mills in a future talk. Charles Mickel was much more than a lumber baron, though. He was, in fact, the mayor of Gravenhurst a number of times. And he was the man who heard that William Gage was traveling the country looking for a place to build the first sanatorium for the treatment of tuberculosis in Canada. He contacted William Gage, asked him to come to Gravenhurst and take a look because it was a very, very health-giving area, they believed. And he made Mr. Gage an offer he couldn't refuse. He said, I will give you $10,000 towards the building of a sanatorium, and I will give you a tract of land on which to build it for free. Well, Mr. Gage could not refuse an offer like that. He'd certainly not had any offer like that anywhere else in Canada. Mickel had to take it to the people, though, for a vote to spend that kind of money. And it's a tribute to the people of Gravenhurst, I think, to say that despite the fact that in all kinds of other communities, they had said, oh no, we don't want a TB sanatorium in our backyard. The people of Gravenhurst voted overwhelmingly in favor of building the Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium here and giving Gage the $10,000 in the free land. Only 5 people voted against it. He didn't stop there. And of course, the sanatorium was built in 1897 and opened then. And of course, 2-3 more sanatoriums were built after that. Became a lifeblood for Gravenhurst when lumber was failing. But Charles Mickel was another man with a vision. He also knew that in 1897, when the town hall burned down, that we needed a place not only for council meetings and town hall business, but we needed a place for entertainments. And so he envisioned a building that would be both town hall and opera house. Some of the people, while it was being built, called it Mickel's Folly in 1900. But in 1901, when it opened with a marvelous, what we call it, extravaganza of local entertainment, in which just about everybody and his grandmother participated, including Thomas Robinson and many others, I think they could say perhaps it was Mickel's triumph. And there is the lasting legacy he left to us. Muskoka Cottage Sanatorium in 1897, the first TB san in Canada, and Gravenhurst Opera House, our pride still today. He was as well a proud father, and he purchased Rosehurst on Bay Street for his wife after their home burned to the ground. And Rosehurst continues today, a protected property designated by Muskoka Municipal Heritage Committee as a designated protected property. That's a picture of a wedding of his daughter, which took place at Rosehurst. There will be some who believe that I've missed out on an important founding family during the years of 1860 to 1880, the founding years. If you know of such a family and you believe should be included in such a talk, let me know about that family so that I can include them the next time. If you have any questions, you can go to the chat room and ask those questions, and I will try to answer them now. If I can't answer them now, or we don't have time for your question, or you think of it later, contact Gravenhurst Archives at the email that's shown there, or call me, and I will be more than happy to attempt to answer your question. I thank you very much for joining me tonight. There is a bookmark which you can pick up at the public library, which lists the History Lives talks that are going to be done, that I'm going to be doing over the course of the year this year. So come in and pick one of those up. And by all means, go to the chat room now if you want to ask a question. Megan is there to take your question, and we will go on from there. If you want to make a donation at any time to Gravenhurst Archives, we've now become much friendlier, and we now can do direct deposit and so on. So do contact Gravenhurst Archives through that email address to find out how you can make a donation. Just a small little thing if you want. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.
Thanks so much, Judy. I do have a question because
Yes.
nobody asked it. Where was that gas station?
I was hoping someone would ask. I was hoping that you might think back to the two pictures that I showed, one of the gas station with those wonderful pumps and the other with a home in the background. If you were, wearing your reading glasses at the time you looked at it, you would recognize that home as being the law office of Aiken and Christensen. And you would therefore realize then that that home of Sid Brown was in fact next door to what we now know of as the Brick today. It was really where Maori's foundry was located, kind of in that area, and where the stable had been located for the Windsor Hotel in 1903 behind today's present post office. So if you know where I'm talking about now, I'm talking about just north of the main intersection on the same side as the post office and just a little bit above where the Brick is located.
Yep, know where that is for sure.
Good.
On Main Street. Yeah. Thank you. That's good to know.
Kind of a fun spot for a gas station.
Yes.
Any other questions?
Megan, have you seen any?
It says a lot of these building projects were very ambitious. Do you have any idea of how they financed these projects?
There were a lot of different ways in which people finance projects. I think I mentioned even just something simple like the log church, the log Anglican church being financed and taking 3 years to actually build because they had to keep getting a little more money for a few more logs. Yeah, some of the people that I've talked about certainly were men and women who had made some money in their lives because they were those hardworking, energetic Scots. So in fact, some of them had their own money. Some of them borrowed money. Municipal projects like the Opera House were usually financed through debentures. And the town would take out debentures. Someone would pick up those debentures, would buy them. They would give the town the, whatever it would be, $10,000 or $20,000. And they would then hold the debentures until the town repaid the debt on those. And debentures were a very favorite way of municipalities building infrastructure.
Great question.
That's a question.
Okay, so I gather that there are no more questions, and if that's the case, I more than thank you for joining me tonight, and I look forward to talking to you again. Oh, one more question.
Would you do a shout out to Jerry Tanner while Steve's on the line?
I would love to do a shout out about Jerry Tanner because I'm hoping that his wife is listening. We have had some wonderful people in the 40-some years that Gravenhurst Archives has been operating. Of course, Cyril and Marion Fry started the archives in 1978. But over the years, all the while that they ran it with the help of other volunteers. Robina Curtin White would be one that I would mention. When I took over the archives in 2015, I was hopeful that I would be able to find some people who would also be wanting to volunteer, because the volunteers from that time were all retiring. I was lucky enough to find, first of all, well, that Jack Klein was going to stay on and do all of the digitizing that he does and has continued to do since 2003. I would guess he spends somewhere in the neighborhood of 4 to 5 hours a day digitizing our collections. It's incredible, but that's what he does. Janet Merkley came along from RIDE, and I was so glad to get her. I'd known her for years because I'd worked with her at the high school. And she has taken over all the accessions. Barry Brock came along, thank goodness, and he's taken on all kinds of tasks, some of the digitizing and some of the answering clients' requests, because we get many requests from people actually across the world about things that have gone on, been built, people who've lived in Gravenhurst. Jerry Tanner, I was so glad to meet and find that he was interested in volunteering in the archives. And I asked him if he would be willing to do digitizing of the microfilmed newspaper collection that we have. And he just jumped right into it with both feet. We had lots of laughs over trying to set up the desk where he was going to work and how we were going to make it all work, because we have a very small archives room. But in fact, Jerry was a more than willing and a very hardworking digitization man, working on our newspaper collection. Every single page that he digitized was so perfectly straight and so perfectly positioned that there's never been a need to actually touch any of them. They are absolutely wonderful. Unfortunately, Jerry became ill at the end of last year, well, mid to end of last year, and we lost Jerry at the end of the year. We miss him dreadfully. I miss his sense of humor. I miss the things he used to send me, jokes and so on that he used to send me. But I also miss the passion that he had for working on the history of Gravenhurst, his newly found town. And I can't say enough about how much I respected and admired and liked him. He was very, very important to us. And we miss you, Jerry. If there's nothing else, we'll say good night. Good night, and we'll talk again in March.
Good night, everyone. Yes, and in March, we've got the rubber set story, so don't miss that. March the 9th.
Looking forward to that. Mm-hmm.
That should be a great thing, you know, historically for Gravenhurst. Judy, I think probably a lot of people are looking forward to hearing about that more. So
great. Looking forward to doing it.
Thanks again, Judy. And thanks again, Megan, for your help.
Good night, everyone.
Good night, everybody.